Hegel is one of the most notoriously difficult but also most fascinating philosophers. And in addition to that, I think his works have almost a kind of a psychedelic quality to them. I also have to admit I'm not really an expert or specialist on Hegel, but more of a fan. And his thinking has deeply influenced my own take on philosophy. So there are two reasons I'm talking about Hegel today. One, from the perspective of the history of philosophy, Hegel just follows after Kant and develops the Kantian project further. So after Kant, basically, you need to do Hegel. But then, also importantly, of course, after Hegel comes Marx. And I think you can't really understand Marx without understanding Hegel properly. And that's, by the way, also, I think, a mistake that people like Jordan Peterson make, who only understand Marx from those who followed after Marx and did all kinds of often weird things with Marx philosophy. But I think from the perspective, at least, of intellectual history, it's more solid to see where Marx comes from in order to understand what really constitutes very central elements of Marxist thought. So that's one reason why I want to do Hegel. Another reason is a personal reason. I studied philosophy at the University of Bonn in Germany, and basically at that time philosophy in Bonn consisted in doing German idealism, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and mostly Kant and Hegel. Therefore, Hegel has had a deep and long-standing influence on the development of my own thought, and it's implicitly, his philosophy is implicitly contained very much also in the You and Your Profile book and other things, and even if I don't really talk about it, the ideas are often very much central to it. So, given that I'm not really an expert, I will not do something like a comprehensive all you need to know about Hegel video, but I'll focus on some selected ideas, some highlights from the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is probably Hegel's most famous work. And the method will be that I'm going to look at some words and passages in the German original, because I think it's important, at least for me, to take a close look at the original text. So, we look at the Phenomenology of Spirit, and we start by looking at the title of the book, Phenomenology of Spirit, and the subtitle was that it's supposed to be part one of a system of science. The original title in German is Wissenschaft der Erfahrung des Bewusstseins, so Science of the Experience of Consciousness. This was the first title Hegel had envisioned for the book, but then later changed it to Phenomenology of Spirit. Now, if we look at this original title, Science of the Experience of Consciousness, we see basically three elements that I want to talk about. First is, including the subtitle, that Hegel views this still as a scientific project, as a sort of a Wissenschaft. Secondly, it is a science that is about Bewusstsein, consciousness, or then, as Hegel calls it, spirit. And then thirdly, it is a science of the experience of consciousness or of spirit, and this is what phenomenology refers to. So we're going to look at these three elements: science, consciousness, and experience or phenomenology. Now first, philosophy as a system of science. Hegel is very clearly here following the Kantian approach to philosophy. He also, like Kant, sees a need for philosophy to regain its function as the most foundational sciences of all sciences, as that which provides the most fundamental knowledge for all other knowledge to be built upon. Importantly, just as for Kant, in order for philosophy to be scientific, it has to be systematic. But systematic means something slightly different for Hegel than it meant for Kant. For Hegel, it means, importantly, that philosophy is not just supposed to be, as he calls it, an aggregate of information. It's not just to be a collection of facts or a collection of data or a collection of propositions. Instead, it is as opposed to number one, consists not of data or information, but of concepts, of certain theoretical entities. And then, most importantly, not in the form of a collection, but in the form of an integrated whole, in which somehow all concepts are interrelated, mutually refer to one another, mutually explain one another, and build up an organic whole, which is not only complete, but also, and this is different between Hegel and Kant, also somehow dynamic, somehow even evolving. Second, this philosophical system is first and foremost to be concerned with consciousness, what Kant called reason, and that what Hegel then calls spirit. Now, for Kant, reason is primarily a cognitive concept. Reason is that which makes sense of that which can be known, right? It is that which produces knowledge. And then on the basis of this, not only theoretical knowledge, but also practical knowledge, knowledge about that which is the right thing to do. Hegel's concept of consciousness goes beyond this relatively narrow cognitive approach of consciousness. It goes beyond an epistemological understanding of what could be called a theory of knowledge, and beyond what could be called a moral epistemology as we find it in Kant. It goes beyond the theory of knowledge about knowing what is the case and about knowing what to do. Instead, for Hegel, consciousness has the wider sense of spirit, which includes even like religious connotations, but also in a secular sense that we speak of something like the spirit of the times, which is a very much a Hegelian notion, right? So it refers to something like a state of mind that informs history, that informs how we think and how we act. So in this sense, the notion of spirit points to something that informs society, informs culture, and informs in both in a personal, but also importantly in a wider sense, a kind of a mindset of society. So in this sense, a philosophy of the spirit is not just an epistemology, not just a theory of knowledge, but is an ontology in that it grounds that which is, and it's also a form of existentialism in the sense that it describes, let's say, the state of mind which informs the way in which we exist. Now, third, and importantly, Hegel uses this term phenomenology. And it seems to be clear to me that phenomenology, this notion, indicates a shift in what we could maybe call the appreciation of appearance. In traditional Western philosophy, starting with the Greeks, appearance was basically something that we needed to, especially philosophy, needed to go beyond in order to get to truth. In Kant, of course, we see already a shift in which philosophy no longer tries to go that which is beyond appearance, but it tries to identify that which conditions experience. So what is a priori the case, and basically that which structures appearance. Now, for Hegel, appearance is neither something that we have to go beyond, nor something the conditions of which we have to explore, but we deal with appearance right away. Not, however, in an empiricist way, where we are just looking at how we experience that which appears to us, but for Hegel, as I said, appearance takes on a positive meaning. And so let's look at the ambiguity of the German word Erscheinung. On the one hand, Erscheinung, appearance, is still has the meaning of semblance, something that seems to be something, but isn't really that. So that is, so to speak, the negative sense of appearance, something which only appears to be but actually isn't. But then, and this is what Hegel really points to, is what we could call the positive sense of Erscheinung, appearance, something that comes into being, something that emerges, and then also, of course, passes away later on. This is how Pinkard, the translator of Hegel, translates an expression that Hegel uses, entstehen and vergehen, the emergence and passing away of something. So that is its appearance. Now, the German word Erscheinung has the element of shining in it. These English and German words are similar. So basically, something that comes to shine, something that shines. So instead of going behind appearance, Hegel is trying to find truth in that which, so to speak, shines. So what we see here is a sort of an emancipation of appearance, right? And by understanding appearance no longer primarily as that which merely appears to be something, but rather by understanding Erscheinung, appearance, as that which emerges and in its emergence, so to speak, begins to shine, the shining spirit. What is a phenomenology of spirit? Phenomenologie des Geistes in German. Importantly, the title is grammatically ambiguous. The spirit is here both the object and the subject of this expression. So the spirit emerges in the world, and the phenomenology is then the investigation of how spirit emerges, appears, shines in the world. But at the same time, the phenomenology of spirit, and this is the ambiguity in the German grammar, it is also the subject which studies its own emergence. So a phenomenology of the spirit, or a phenomenology of spirit, is both a science of and by the emerging intellect. So spirit studies its own appearance. So the mind emerges, but at the same time, it studies itself, and these are just two moments of the same thing, that the mind, by relating itself to itself, also emerges, evolves, develops, appears. So that is very different from Kant, where, so to speak, reason steps to the side and looks at itself as if it would be standing outside of it and would thereby basically remain unchanged. It looks at an a priori structure, a structure that as such is not dynamic. For Hegel, and again indicated through the dynamic ambiguity, grammatical ambiguity of the title, this is actually a growth process, a dynamic, almost feedback process by which the spirit, by analyzing, understanding its own coming into being, also comes into being. So it is both the subject and the object of this study, and this dynamic is essentially what the phenomenology of spirit practices. In relation to what we could call basically some form of reversal of the truth-appearance distinction, in which truth is no longer something that lies behind appearance or is prior to appearance, but is in appearance, we also see a kind of a different notion of reality. Namely that reality, again, is not something that is in opposition or in contradistinction to the apparent, but is something like an effect of appearance. And for reality, Hegel uses the German word wirklich. Now, the term is sometimes also translated as actual or actuality, Wirklichkeit as a noun. Now, the word wirklich, the German word wirklich, is, as you can probably hear, etymologically related to the English word work. So that somehow indicates that something is real in as far as it has a certain Wirkung, not only has an effect, that it somehow works, that it is somehow active. So only that which appears can be real. Only then can it somehow be at work, be active. And that which isn't working in appearance, which isn't working through basically coming into being and then shining, has no reality. And interestingly, Hegel also uses frequently the word Arbeit or labor as a metaphor. So the coming into being of spirit, of the mind, of the intellect, and thereby it's becoming real in the sense of being at work, also has the aspect of being some form of labor. Let's now turn to the notion of experience. So again, the original title for the Phenomenology of Spirit, which means the same thing, was the science of the experience of consciousness. So let's turn to the notion of experience here. Experience, too, in this context, is a very kind of activist notion. And again, we can look at the German usage of the word Erfahrung, which then in English is experience. In English, you have an experience or you have experiences. So that's basically a passive mode in which experience is experienced, right? You take in something from the outside, and this is also how the term was basically understood in, for instance, British empiricism. Now, in German, you don't have an experience, you make an experience. Man macht eine Erfahrung. So this already indicates an active conception of experience. In order to describe Hegel's analysis of the experience of consciousness as not just a passive intake, but as an active process, I'd like to talk about very briefly in the beginning of the actual first chapter when Hegel talks about consciousness. And here Hegel talks about what he calls a sinnliche Gewissheit, sense certainty, which for him is the most primitive form of knowing, of knowledge, of consciousness, of the activity of consciousness. And he says, like, the most immediate form of knowledge you can have, let's say maybe as a newborn baby, you experience everything immediately in the form of here and now. So everything that you experience is immediately in the form of sense certainty, here and now. However, in the very next moment, what is here and now, Hegel gives the example of a tree, is replaced in the next moment by something else. You turn around and then here and now is no longer a tree, but here and now is, let's say, a house. So this shows, and I'm simplifying this analysis by Hegel here, so this shows that sense certainty is not something that is merely a passive intake of that which is right now here, but that of course the notions of here and now are equally dependent on me being here and now, and what is here and now is here and now for me and because of me. So again, this shows very much that this experience of consciousness is not merely a passive intake of that which is here and now, but equally at the same time also something that I make to be here and now. So at this moment, let's turn to the text and look at one of Hegel's notoriously difficult sentences, but I think we can make sense of them. in paragraph 86 of the Phenomenology of Spirit, following here again Pinkard, Hegel says the following: consciousness knows something, and this object is the essence, that is, the in itself. However, the object is also the in itself for consciousness. As a result, the ambiguity of this truth emerges. We see that consciousness now has two objects. One is the first in itself, and the second is the being for it of this in itself. So let's analyze this sentence here. So consciousness knows something, we know something, and this something that we know, let's say a tree or a house, at first sight seems to be determined as just an object, right? And this objective element is what Hegel calls the in itself. However, we also understand, as we explained in the example with the here and now, that it is something for consciousness. Therefore, we arrive at what Hegel calls here the ambiguity of this truth. We see that on the one hand, there is something that has an objective quality, but we see on the other hand that what has an objective quality, let's say the here and now, the tree that is here and now, has this objective quality for a subject that experiences it. So these are the two simple moments, in itself, the objective moment, and the for itself, the subjective moment, that are related to one another. So this is what Hegel calls the dialectical movement of experience. It means that understanding the objective world is at the same time also a mental effort of the human subject. So an experience, again, is not something that you simply take in, but also something that you actively make. And this is important. By making this experience, the mind develops, the mind grows. It does not stay the same. So let's say, for instance, in the process of a lifetime, you move on from understanding something objectively as water when you're young, and then you become a chemist, and then you understand this is actually not water, it's much better described as H2O with a chemical formula. Now, in this shift of the understanding of the object from, let's say, water to H2O, what at the same time also takes place is a subjective state. You're not the same anymore when you are a scientist. You have undergone a building of consciousness and now, so to speak, have a different mindset and see and experience the world differently. So again, this is just to show that your relation to the objective world, or the relation of the mind to the objective world, brings about also and is a subjective movement, a subjective growth process. And this is what, again, Hegel calls the dialectical movement of experience. So we see knowledge is active, it's alive, it's evolving, it's developing. And this metaphoric of being alive rather than being dead is something that we find throughout the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's maybe the most important, let's say, metaphor. And again, this is supposed to and does distinguish the Hegelian approach to spirit from the Kantian approach to reason, right? For Kant, reason was basically to be understood as an a priori structure that is not subject to change and development. But for Hegel, this is not the case. Spirit is active, alive, and evolving. Again, therefore, the science of the spirit cannot be merely a collection of data, but not only reflects, but actually is an organic process. So in this context, we can look at another sentence from the Phenomenology of Spirit, from section 17, where he says, "In my view, everything depends on understanding and expressing truth, not just as substance, but just as much as subject." Here again, Hegel's idealism comes to the fore. When we understand truth, then we must not look at it as something that is determined, let's say, by its objective content, but at the same time that truth is something that is produced through subjective consciousness. And that's already the case in the most simple, immediate form of sense certainty, right? The here and the now has a subjective quality as much as it has a substantial reference. To further discuss this dynamic aspect of the experience of consciousness, I'd like to point to one of maybe the most famous metaphors that Hegel uses at the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit. And I quote here from section 21, where Hegel says, "Although an embryo is in itself human, it is not yet human for itself. It is only human for itself as built reason that made itself into what it is in itself. Only then it is real." So in this short example, basically all of the ideas that we talked about are combined. So importantly, Hegel brings up here a notion which is very central to his whole project, the notion of Bildung, which in English I think we can simply translate as, literally translate as building. Right? The two words are, again, the English word to build comes from this German root. So Bildung in German is literally in English basically building. Now, of course, Hegel doesn't have in mind here the building of, a house or something, but the building of the mind through intellectual activity. So through thinking, through experiencing the world, through making experiences, through engagement with the world, reason builds itself, and as Hegel again here says, makes itself into subjective consciousness. So the embryo as something does not yet have built consciousness is something that is from the outside objectively human, but since it lacks subjectivity, it is not in and for itself human. And this aspect of the for itself is something that only comes into being, that only shines through building itself, through making experiences. And then he says, only then, once it has this subjective aspect to it, only then it is wirklich, which is what we said earlier, only then it is working. Only then it is real. So again here we have this emphasis on something being real, something having Wirklichkeit through the capacity of being at work, so to speak. Wirklichkeit is work and Bildung is building. Now, how do you build? How does the mind build itself? Importantly, and somewhat maybe paradoxically, building is not just for Hegel something that is merely positive, but a central element to it is for Hegel negativity. So he speaks kind of poetic language of the tremendous power of the negative, that is the energy of thought. And this is in section 28. So interestingly, the intellect moves forward, builds itself and works through negation. right? Here and now is a tree, but then we see, no, here and now is a house. So this is later on maybe on a much more complex level what the philosopher of science Popper called the element of falsification in society. Again, this is on a much more complex level, on science level, but nevertheless there is the parallel that knowledge works and increases and builds itself through a process of falsification. And again, Hegel uses the metaphor of labor, of Arbeit here. It speaks, for instance, in section 19 of the labor of the negative. So basically, consciousness moves on, moves forward by critically negating previous stages of knowledge. And that is work. To merely affirm something is easier than actually denying something and moving on through such a critical negation. This moving forward through negation has an important consequence regarding the distinction between false and correct. It means that the false in a philosophical system is not to be simply dismissed. Or in other words, philosophy by no means consists only of true propositions. It's somehow very different, this approach to philosophy, from what we have at least in parts of analytic philosophy, where at least it seems to me as an outsider to be the intention to somehow cleanse philosophy of all false propositions and only end up with true propositions. For Hegel, importantly, I'm quoting here section 39, the false as a moment of truth is no longer false. So in the context of the labor of the negative, we see that the false is a necessary element of the true. And that by identifying something as false, we at the same time also see why that which is false played an essential role for arriving at that which is right. To give you like a concrete example of this, Hegel therefore does not aim at dismissing other philosophers that came before him as merely false. The idea is, again, that the life of the spirit, the development of the history of philosophy, reflects a dynamic evolution of consciousness to which each false philosophy essentially contributes. To illustrate this process, Hegel gives a nice metaphorical example already in the second section of the Phenomenology, and I quote this here. The bud disappears when the blossom breaks through, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. Likewise, through the fruit, the blossom itself may be declared to be a false existence of the plant, since the fruit emerges as the blossom's truth as it comes to replace the blossom itself. These forms are not only distinguished from each other, but as incompatible with each other, they also supplant each other. However, at the same time, their fluid nature makes them into moments of an organic unity in which they are not only not in conflict with each other, but rather one is equally as necessary as the other. And it is this equal necessity which alone constitutes the life of the whole. Again, here we have a lot of the ideas combined that we talked about earlier. Importantly, at the end, the life of the whole is what really counts. So we see consciousness not as an a priori non-dynamic static structure, but as a living process. And in this living process, each, let's say, evolutionary stage has equal necessity. right? So, I mean, think about your own life, right? The person that you were before you became a chemist and looked as water is no less your true self than your current true self as a chemist. So all these different developmental stages, even though the earlier one seem somehow false from the perspective of the more advanced one, are not really false if you look at them from the perspective of the life of the whole. Similarly, if you look at a plant and the life of a plant, then the bud is no less a true element of the plant as the blossom or the fruit. This leads us to the famous notion of Aufhebung, or sublation, as it is usually translated, which describes this development of consciousness by, at the same time, referring to three somewhat contradictory moments. Aufheben is a very common German word. It's not a philosophical term as such, and nevertheless it combines three meanings. It combines two meanings that also the word to lift has in English. To lift something in the sense of to raise something to a higher level, but also lift in the sense of lifting sanctions, for instance, to invalidate something. But then there's a third meaning that Aufheben has, that is to maintain something, to keep something. We see how this, in this process of the life of the plant, or in this process of the development of a person's consciousness from looking at something as water and then looking at something as H2O, we see these three moments combined. So, of course, consciousness somehow moves on to a higher stage by moving on from the stage of water to H2O. And somehow we can also argue in the life of the plant, when it moves from the bud to the blossom and to the fruit, that there is some form of elevation to a higher, more developed stage. But at the same time, there is also the negation process, that which previously was the case is no longer the case. The bud has to disappear for the blossom to break through. And somehow your naive conception of water disappears, is invalidated once you understand that it's kind of a chemical, that it consists chemically of H2O. And nevertheless, it is precisely in this process of lifting, in the two senses of raising and invalidating, that the plant, or the mind for that matter, maintains itself. Right? It is in developing, in no longer being what you were before, in no longer having the state of mind that you had before, that your mind maintains itself. And the same thing about the plant. Now, Hegel's notion of Aufhebung, which incorporates a sense of negation in growth, in life, also has an important effect on his understanding of language and how philosophy should speak, how philosophy should express itself. We find in Hegel an interesting critique of the idea that philosophy can express itself in the form of normal propositions, of regular propositions in which we normally speak, in the form of regular arguments, we might say. Because he thinks the very structure of the sentence, of these sentences, is too simple to reflect the complex and somewhat self-contradictory dialectical movement of experience. So he says, instead of regular propositions, philosophy must speak in what he calls the speculative sentence. And he gives an example, this is in section 62, for such a speculative sentence, the sentence, God is being. I'd like to use a variation of this here to make Hegel's argument maybe a little bit more clear. So instead of saying God is being, maybe we can say God is love. And that is similar to what actually Hegel's student and follower Ludwig Feuerbach did in his book, The Essence of Christianity. So we can understand the sentence, God is love, in a speculative way, different from how we understand it, let's say, in a common way. In the common way, love would just be a predicate, an attribute, a characteristic of God that is somehow attached to God. Now, that is what the normal subject-predicate structure of the sentence suggests. However, in a speculative sense, God is love means that God, so to speak, realizes the godly essence in being love, so that God, so to speak, transitions into love and becomes love. So we could understand the sentence in such a way that the divine is realized in the human practice of love. And in the human practice of love, the divine, on the one hand, is negated, it is completely secularized, but it appears in a more concrete, in a more subjective state, and therefore is developed into love. So again, and thereby, by becoming human love, God, so to speak, maintains divinity. So the speculative sentence is understood in such a way that the predicate, love, does not merely represent an attribute, a characteristic of the subject, but it represents the movement of the subject, the development of the subject, which contains also the labor of the negative, a negation of the subject. And this is why Hegel says, I'm quoting here again section 60, the subject is found transitioned into the predicate and thereby sublated and thereby lifted. Right? So the speculative sentence is basically a sentence which reflects the motion of Aufhebung or sublation or lifting. One final linguistic thing, that is the notion of the concept, der Begriff. As we said at the beginning, a scientific philosophical system consists of concepts. The notion of the concept, again, the German word is Begriff, which is a very common German word, and Griff and Begriff is corresponds to the English word grip. So the Begriff is also the grasp. And also in English, the word to grasp has this double meaning. It can mean physically to grasp something, but of course it can also mean mentally to understand something. And Begriff, the concept, also has this meaning of enhancing subjectivity, enhancing the subjective activity of consciousness. Once you grasp something physically, it's under your control and you can do something with it. And similarly, once mentally you develop a concept of something, you have, so to speak, this object under subjective control and can subjectively operate with it and develop it. Right? Similarly, to give a simple example, when we don't yet have a certain concept, for instance, of the number 3, then as small children, we always have to, refer to 3 concrete things, whatever. You learn to understand the concept of 3 by referring to whatever, 3 apples or something else, 3 books, and then, there's 3 things. But then you move on from this a non-conceptual understanding of three to a conceptual understanding of threeness. And once you did this, once you grasp threeness, then you subjectively you are capable of doing mathematics. This movement from the non-conceptual to the conceptual is also tied to the idea of consciousness, the mind, of spirit, becoming more powerful, becoming more active, becoming more subjective. It is important, and I want to conclude with this, that this experience of consciousness that I was describing so far, mainly with respect to the dynamic activist element of it, is extended, and this is a large part of the phenomenology of spirit, not just to how consciousness deals with the objective world, and thereby develops its own subjectivity, but perhaps even more importantly, largest part of the phenomenology deals with the question how consciousness interacts with other consciousness, how not subject and object, but how subject and subject interact with one another. So here, the same dialectical movement of the experience of consciousness applies, only on a higher, more complex level. And because of limits of time, I don't want to talk about this in detail, and other interpreters of Hegel have done so, particularly with the master-slave dialectics, which is the introductory passage which introduces this, so to speak, intersubjective dialectic. I only want to talk about it in terms of three simple German words again that illustrate this increase in complexity of consciousness activity. And these three words are kennen, erkennen, and anerkennen. So the word kennen becomes ever more complex. First one prefix is added, and then two prefixes are added. So on the first stage, which is the most simple stage of objective knowledge, you know something, but then that's kennen. Then you move on to erkennen, which means to actually understand something. But then once you move from the objective to the intersubjective activity of consciousness, then you also know and understand other people, but importantly, you move on to anerkennen them, to recognize them, which is something you cannot do with something that is a mere object. So once you get to consciousness relating to other consciousness, one mind, one human being relating to another human being, then you move beyond the consciousness activity of kennen and erkennen, of knowing and understanding, into a different dimension of recognition. But the same dialectical movement also applies here. And not only on an individual level, but generally on a social and historical level, where not only two individuals mutually recognize one another, but somehow humankind recognizes itself, and thereby society and history evolves and develops. This was the setup for a second video on Hegel that we are planning to do, and the second video will be on three major themes. Number one, Hegel's concept of necessity, which I find very interesting, and I'll explain why I find it interesting. Then secondly, I want to talk about the relation between Hegel and Marx, and one reason I want to do this is because I also want to critique Jordan Peterson's reception of Marx. And thirdly, I want to talk about the relation between Hegel and Nietzsche and postmodernism. Hope you'll be interested in that as well. Thanks.